you're going through them pretty quickly.
Right.
So that was in January of '73, and then in March or April, quite soon thereafter, maybe 3 months later. But I've had these 3 months of being in kind of the boot camp of the Salters and Roskin approach to publicity. He said, "Do we want this band Led Zeppelin?" Mm-hmm. So I said, "Yeah, they're one of the biggest bands." He says, "Well, you better come with me to the meeting because I don't understand anything about that music." So we flew to Paris. I'd never been to Europe.
Yeah.
With him.
How old are you here?
22.
It's incredible.
Jesus.
You're like Zelig. Has anybody ever told you that before?
I've heard it before.
You've got to have heard that before. That's like, that Woody Allen movie, Zelig?
Oh, you've never seen Zelig?
Oh, it's incredible.
It's such a good movie.
He's just everywhere in history that's relevant. This guy's like that in the music business. It's unbelievable.
So I actually haven't seen Zelig for a long time. I might watch it again on the
it's
weekend.
time to rewatch it.
Yeah, time to rewatch it. It was.
So you're going to Europe.
So we go to Paris,
right,
and stayed at the Georges V Hotel because that's where Zeppelin was staying.
They were already pretty famous.
They were huge.
They were huge.
No, they were at their peak.
Okay.
The previous album that they had made at the time I met them, their most recent album was Led Zeppelin 4.
Wow, so they were
which
huge.
had Stairway to Heaven on it.
Yeah.
So they were at their apex.
But they were, just to let people know, the reason they were trying to hire the publicity department is because they were getting ravaged by the critics still, right?
Well, what happened with Zeppelin is that their first album came out in '69, I think. And I was actually at Billboard when their album came up, and they happened to walk into the chart department and say, "Hi, we're Led Zeppelin." And I didn't talk to them. I was just, "Hello,"
Right.
And that was like this weird thing. And what's Led Zeppelin? And then like a month later, it's like, boom, Good Times, Bad Times, and all that sort of thing. So the rock press was made up of people of a certain age, mostly mid-20s. I was say people 5 years older than me were sort of the taste makers, the Rolling Stone in particular writers. But it wasn't only Rolling Stone, but they epitomized it. And they all loved, the Cream and the blues and the earlier, the Stones. And Zeppelin comes along, number one, as sort of being looked at as derivative, believe it or not, of Cream, even though they far outshone Cream ultimately musically. And secondly, by '69, FM radio had blossomed into this very powerful thing for the American rock audience. Earlier, in '67, there was no... Rock radio starts in '67. There was no such thing as an FM radio station that played rock and roll until '67. It was started in San Francisco by a guy named Tom Donahue. It got great ratings right away. And then by '68, by '69, there's no city, medium or big, in North America that doesn't have an FM station playing rock and roll. And it became later, it was called AOR, rock radio.
Right.
In the beginning, it was called underground radio, believe it or not. And so Zeppelin...
AOR, album-oriented radio.
Yeah, that becomes the jargon by the mid-'70s. But in '69, it's just called underground radio.
Right.
And they came out exactly the right time. There was a guy at Atlantic named Mario Medius, whose nickname was the Big M, who Atlantic hired one guy.
The Big M. Get the Big M.
Yeah, he was the first guy to ever do promotion at rock radio.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the mystique of Atlantic was the Big M. African-American guy who promoted rock and roll. And I interviewed him for one of my books about, I met him later, but I didn't know him then. I said, "So what happened?" He says, "Man, I went to WBCN in Boston, and they all hated Led Zeppelin because they liked the real blues. They liked Sonny Boy Williamson and all this stuff. And I explained to them, I am the blues.
Right.
They were all these white boys. I'm told them that this is real." And J.J. Jackson, who was one of the few black DJs on rock radio, first guy to play Led Zeppelin, and boom, they played it once, and the phones go crazy. So within 2 weeks, Led Zeppelin's first album is one of the best-selling albums in the country, and the rock critics had nothing to do with it.
Right.
Zero.
So they went in.
So they hated it, both generationally, because suddenly they were a little older. When you're 25... you're a lot older than a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
You know, you're not young. Now you're the next generation. It's a
Right.
shock
It is.
to not be that cutting edge anymore. It happens really quickly.
It does.
You know,
You blink and it's gone.
you blink and it's gone.
Yeah.
And so they decided, so all the reviews were bad. And the same thing happened in England for other cultural reasons I don't understand. The press, for same psychological reasons.
Could be jealousy. 'Cause
So it was
Zeppelin
jealousy.
so amazing. That
It was
maybe
jealousy, and they hadn't discovered it. It was
Right.
like,
It wasn't theirs.
you know, and it wasn't theirs. And the fans were younger, and they were like not into feeling old when you're 25. That's like, what is that all about? So for whatever reason, they got bad press, and so Jimmy Page, who was the first among equals in Zeppelin, and Peter Grant, their manager, decided, fuck the press. We just won't fucking talk to them. So for several years, they hardly ever did any interviews, would be rude to the press, wouldn't give them backstage passes, were tough about giving anybody photo passes. They were like the rebels. Then a few years passed. They've become commercially, literally the biggest rock band in the world. Their concert attendance and their record sales are now bigger than the Stones.
Wow.
And Robert Plant told me, because later on, after I was writing, I said, why did you decide? He says, you know, I was tired of my parents not knowing I was successful,
Right.
you know. And
Because they would just read it.
They
and
would
they
just
were
read,
like,
you know.
This is a
he
joke.
Says, and then I saw and then he says, and then I saw the Stones on the cover of Newsweek. And that was just so ridiculous. I knew we were. So for whatever it was, I don't know if it was just Robert, but the band decides let's get a publicist. And lucky for me, they reach out to a company that had hired me as the rock guy. We go to the meeting. So I'm on the plane with Lee, and he says, "Well, tell me about the Zeppelin. Tell me about the Zeppelin." I says, "Well, look, the writers in America don't like them. They consider them almost barbarians. There was a story about them like pushing around a female journalist who wrote about them as being very uncouth, you know, grabbing her breasts or something like that." And he says, like, so we get to the meeting with Peter. So we get there, and we're supposed to meet first with their manager, Peter Grant. Peter Grant was a former professional wrestler.
Scary dude.
Physically intimidating,
That's when you wish you had your
300-pound
gun again.
300-pound guy who knew a lot of British gangsters, and people were scared of him. Intimidating dude. And we go in and meet with him, and Lee says, tell Peter about what you said. Tell Peter about you said the barbarians thing. I said, oh, well, you know, I talked to some of my writer friends, and, you know, they came up with, you know, they're worried like that the band is like barbarians. And Peter gave me this big grin. He had these capped teeth, these shiny white teeth, big grin. And he says, yeah, but, and I can't do a Cockney accent.
Right.
He says, yeah, but we're just mild barbarians, you know?
Good band name, the Mild Barbarians.
So, you know, the next day I met with the band, and then we were the publicists, and then you know, they start the tour. Houses of the Holy was the album. Comes out. Rolling Stone gives it another terrible review. One of the great Zeppelin albums to me is Houses of the Holy.
Masterpiece.
Incredible how that holds up.
It's unbelievable.
And they write Led Zeppelin.
Great album cover too.
Yeah. Led Zeppelin, Limp Blimp. That's Rolling Stones. They're
Unreal.
still down. So
Shout out Rolling Stones.
So I'm trying to. So I had to figure. So I the only thing I could think of is an angle, because Lee Salters told me this word, angle. You need an angle. If you're going to go to the press, you have to give them an angle.
A story.
A story, an angle. What's the? So the only angle I could think of wasn't that I could never convince the critics that they were good, but I convinced the editors that they were big.
Right. They
and
were
that
relevant.
You've got to cover this.
Yeah.
And the first show they did on the American tour when I was the publicist, again, just luck, was Atlanta Stadium, 50,000 people. No one else on the bill, just Led Zeppelin. They didn't have an opening act. They played 2.5 hours.
Crazy.
And I'm with Lee, and he says, did you call this one? Did you call that one? I said, yeah, Lee, I called everybody. He says, what about the wire services? And I'm like a deer in the headlights, like, what? AP and UPI. And he looks so exasperated at me. Okay. You know, I had never thought of that, you know, to call the Associated Press and the UPI. Wire services were these services that for there were 1,000 newspapers in America.
Right,
And they couldn't all hire a music writer.
Right.
So 900 of them would get their stories from these services, the Associated Press and UPI. I think AP still exists. You'll see Associated Press on stories.
They do.
So, and the second show was in Tampa, Florida, and that was 56,800 people. So I used to carry around a portable typewriter with me and paper. I put it in my suitcase. And so after Tampa, the second show, I write up this press release, because the Beatles, when they headlined Shea Stadium, it was 55,000 some people, because that's what Shea Stadium held.
Mm-hmm.
And Zeppelin, the Tampa Stadium was 56.8. So I say, breaks Beatles record, for biggest audience of a single artist.
That's your angle,
That's
ladies
my
and
angle.
gentlemen. That's the angle.
And
that's something they can run with.
And I got a cab to the UPI office, and the guy's there by himself. It's Tampa UPI stringer, not a big job.
Right.
And, okay, thanks. And, put it on the wire. And, years later, when Zeppelin did their very last Zeppelin show was in London. It was a reunion for some charity.
When was that?
What?
What year?
5 years ago.
Yeah.
I forget when.
Oh,
I know I went with Pele from the Hives. So it was while I was having this company. But sometime in the last decade, after not having anything for years, they did a little movie they put together about Zeppelin that they showed, because it was literally the last Led Zeppelin show, maybe the last one that there ever will be. And they were nice enough to let me go to it. And in the film, like they show a close-up of that newspaper,
headline.
breaks Beatles record.
Right.
First time I knew because they never would say that was great or good job or nothing.
But they could say that.
But 50 years later, I said, okay, I guess they dug that,
Yeah.
So then we were off to the races.
I see. They would never say to you, "Great job."
No.
Why not?
It wasn't the culture.
Wasn't the thing. Yeah.
It was. Look, Robert was always nice to me, and to this day, I just saw him a few months ago in a festival in San Francisco. He's the nicest guy.
Yeah, he's aged well.
Yeah,
like
he was
this
nice
business.
then. He's nice now. I really appreciate it. But it was a lot of cocaine. I was not on. I was straight guy.
They were
then.
gods.
They were gods. Their part of the culture was to look down on the business,
right?
To look down on the idea of Robert would say to me, "Okay, what else do you want me to do?" And I'd say, "Robert, I work for you. It's whatever you don't want me to set up interviews. I want to set up interviews." But he wanted to pretend I was forcing him to do them.
That's his angle.
Because he didn't want to look at himself as a guy that liked doing interviews, even though he was.
Right.
He was great at doing interviews.
That held through all the way through the 90s and only shifted recently now, where I think musicians are more like, we're all businessmen, and like that's like what we're supposed to be ambitious. Like that's cool now.
Yeah.
To start a podcast is cool now. But in the 90s, that would be like... But I heard you were right behind Bob Gruen when he took that famous photo of them on the Zeppelin plane, like the Zeppelin plane photo.
I'm sure I was there. I'm sure I called him. That was my job, was to call photographers and journalists to get pictures. Sure, I'm sure I was there.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, I was their publicist. That's how anyone would know where to go, is because I would send them a release saying.
But did they have publicists in the UK? You were their first ever publicist.
I just did it in the U.S. I was the American guy. I didn't do the rest of the world for them. I don't know exactly what they did in the U.K. There was a period of time where there was a guy named B.P. Fallon, who's kind of a legendary character in England. He was also close to Mark Bolan. Did press for them for a while. Annie Ivell at Atlantic was a British woman who would sometimes do press for them in the UK, but my job was strictly the United States.
So how long did you work in publicity, and how did you then go into the music business to ultimately become like a head of a record company and all that?
Well, it took a long time, obviously. I worked for Salter. After 1 year at Salters and Roskin, Zeppelin hired me to work full-time for them, because I didn't even know if they liked me after that tour. And then Peter... I got called by their lawyer. Would you meet with Peter? Would you fly over to England, meet with Peter? He wants to talk to you about something. Like, okay. And he offered me this job. He says, Jimmy and I really appreciate what you did, and do you want to work for us? I said, cool. So I got a raise. I was making $15,000 a year at Salters and Roskin, and Zeppelin paid me $25,000 a year. That was a big increase.
That's a huge leap.
And plus, I just thought, I got to take this shot. The biggest band in the world. So I went to work for them. I worked for them for about 3 years. Then I
just publicity still, or did
no?
You do
Well,
other
then
things?
Peter says, "Would you want to be our head of publicity?"
Assistant manager,
So I said, I think I'd be taken more seriously if I had a broader title. He says, well, what title do you want? I said, how about just vice president of Swan Song? He said, fine.
Wow.
Nobody worked there. He was president.
Right.
They owned it. He's fine. Be
What
vice
was
president.
Swan
Swan
Song was their
Song
label.
was the
Their own
label
label?
that Led Zeppelin created. In those days, the Beatles had created Apple. Rolling Stones had Rolling Stones Records. So if you were a superstar band, Jefferson Airplane had their own label called Grunt Records. So Zeppelin, it was like a badge of superstardom to have your own label. And
What gave you the wherewithal to make that, proposition to him? Like, where do
I
you
have
think
no
where do
idea.
you think that comes from?
I don't know. I have
You
no
don't
idea.
you don't know where that inspiration came from, because I think that's like something that would like separate the. I mean, this sounds. I hate that I'm wording it this way. The men from the boys. I hate wording it that way, but that's what's coming into my head, and I can't think of another way to put it. But like, I think that's a key to your rise in this whole career.
I don't know where I got it from.
I want to
Maybe-
know where you got that.
I don't know whether it was from my parents,
Right.
who did love me. They were very disappointed that I dropped out of college and terrified when I got into problem with drugs. But they did always tell me I was smart.
Were they digging this vibe? When
took
you were
them a
like,
while. They didn't understand
when you're
it.
vice president of Swan
They
Song?
didn't. My
No,
mother.
still
When I
not.
got the job, my mother says, "You sure you don't want to just go back to college?"
Right.
No, I swear to God. No, and I said, Mother, I know you don't know who Led Zeppelin is, but please believe
Right.
me.
I'm
This is-
crushing it at life.
Oh my god!
I'm seriously crushing it right now.
And it was only maybe till the end of the 70s, till I was almost 30, like
Yeah.
around 79 or 80, my parents got it that I had
Yeah.
actually found a career. It's not their fault. They never heard of such a
Right.
thing. What is this rock and roll?
Yeah.
What did I do where?
It's Swan. As vice president. What was
Well,
your
the job was mostly publicity.
Oh, still publicity.
Still a
Okay.
publicity.
Right.
Publicity.
But
Vice
but I,
president.
but I had a broader set of things because I ended up Swan Song wasn't really a label; it was more of an imprint.
Yeah, because they
And
were
the-
on Atlantic.
and the
right?
label was Atlantic.
Yeah.
And Atlantic just gave them this imprint. So I was the one that would go to Atlantic and meet with the promo people and the salespeople on behalf of the band because they were all in England. Peter was my boss, but he only came to America periodically. And they had one other executive named Steve Weiss, who was a lawyer. So all the negotiations, the money, the business deals, Steve Weiss controlled completely. I had nothing to do with that or didn't even know what the details of it were. But anything to do with dealing with the booking agencies or because they did sign some other acts. And again, this is a Zelig thing. So many lucky things happened. And one of the many lucky things that happened was that the first album released on Swan Song was Bad Company's first album, Bad Co.
Huge.
Which had a #1 single, Can't Get Enough of Your Love, and a #1 album. So now I'm the vice president of
And
a
you look
company
like
with
a
a number.
genius.
Yeah, I was just there.
Right.
I mean, we mailed it out. We
I
mailed.
put the stamp on it.
I mean, we had these. Then in those days, you would physically mail out the records to the press. We mailed it out.
You must have good karma from a past life.
Thank you,
Something.
God.
Wow.
Something. So, was Peter Green an intimidating character to
Peter
work
Grant.
for? I mean, sorry, Peter Grant.
Peter Grant, great guitar player.
Yeah, Peter Green. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great guitar. But Peter Grant, was he intimidating?
Peter Grant could be very intimidating.
Because I heard that.
He did. He was good to me. He really was. I owe him so much, and I got to thank him. He passed away at least 15 years ago. We had, and I did have a phone conversation with him maybe a year before he died, where I really got to thank him, and he was so sweet about it. But he was good to me. I learned a lot from him. I learned how to be a manager from him.
Right.
It was the same way I learned how to be a publicist by watching Lee Salters. If you talk about what that idea of mentor, that overused word. I mean, Peter, I worked for him for 2.5 years, and his idea was fuck everybody else. All that matters is what the artist. We work for the artist. Don't suck up to the record company. Don't suck up to the concert promoters. Don't suck up to the media. It's all about what the band wants. That's what we care about. And I carry that attitude to this day when I think of, not with the swagger of Peter Grant. For one thing, I don't have anybody as big as Led Zeppelin. It's a little easier to swagger when you're representing Zeppelin than. But
you've been in that position before.
he was he was physically intimidating. I mean, first of all, he was 300 pounds. So just sitting next to him in a limo when the car took a left turn, he I'd have hundreds of pounds. He was just physically intimidating. He was definitely somebody that when he was angry was intimidating and would get into physical fights, although I never saw him hit anybody.
Right.
There's no question in my mind he did from time to time. And, there's that documentary, The Song Remains the Same. There's some footage of Peter backstage yelling at somebody who had bootlegged Zeppelin T-shirts, and I was working for them there. I was at that show that was filmed for "Song Remains the Same." That was at the Garden in '73.
That's amazing.
So he was, he could definitely be intimidating, and he could sometimes be very, very brilliant, and he also sometimes made mistakes. Which again, the cocaine, and all that sort of a thing.
Exasperates.
But I was always worried about him being mad at me. I walked around in a constant state of anxiety about not wanting Peter to be mad at me. But he was mostly pretty nice to me. I got to say, I was really lucky that way. I owe him a lot, and he taught me a lot by example. And he liked me, and he put me in that position. He changed my life. I mean, to this day, that's my biggest calling card, is that I work for Zeppelin. I mean, first time I met Nirvana,
really,
Dave Grohl wanted to hear Zeppelin stories.